Great to be here. I thought I'd start off with a little bit of social geekiness, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. This is Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher, who wrote that man is by nature a social animal. I like to think of him as sort of the prophet of social networking. The irony is that most of the pioneers of social networking have tended to be people who are kind of at one point or another rather socially deprived. The founder of Blogger, Evan Williams, the guy who invented that, grew up in practically the loneliest place in America, which is a county in Nebraska that had an average of 16 people per square mile. I did the math on that, and works out to one person every 40 acres, which if you're standing in a field, which I think is kind of what people in Nebraska do a lot, that means that every person is a quarter mile apart. Jack Dorsey, the guy who invented Twitter, had this weird obsession from childhood with dispatch writing. And things that fleets of vehicles that like ambulances, police cars, buses, taxis that are always reporting in with their status updates. You can see how this might have evolved ultimately into Twitter. And then the guy who invented Facebook was so geeky that even though in real life he had a girlfriend, in the movie version he didn't. So. And Spinoza was no exception. He worked as a lens grinder in Amsterdam. He turned down honors and professorships, and he managed to get himself expelled from the Jewish faith, even as his works were banned by the Catholic Church. So he got rejected not just by one religion, but by two. Now, it was only after his death that his contribution to philosophy was actually widely recognized. And I think it's only today that we can fully appreciate it. Because Spinoza saw that the sociability of humans was really key to our behavior. There's no question, I think, that he was right. Today, it's really easy to see just how connected we are. This is a map of world Facebook connections. It was done last year by an intern at Facebook who set out to map all of the connections, all of the people who were connected on Facebook. It took him a while, but what he got ultimately was, as you can see, almost a map of the world. We're used to maps that show divisions, and this is a map that shows connections. And you see what happens. You see cities blurring together. You can see the outlines of countries and continents. As the intern wrote in a blog post, you see not coasts or rivers or political borders, but real human relationships. And if you notice what's missing there, aside from places that are really cold or really in the jungle, is Russia and China. And it's not that they're not connected, it's just that they're not connected to us. They have their own social media networks, and they kind of exist in an alternate universe. And the thing is, it's not as if these connections didn't exist before. What's changed is that social media has revealed them, has enhanced them, has made them tangible, and in some senses at least, I think, has strengthened them. It's given form and structure to the idea of people reaching out to one another, to our drive to connect to one another. It's made our drive to connect as tangible as rays of light on a dark and lonely planet. So here's another map. I'm kind of a map freak, I'm afraid. And this one was created by a Barcelona data visualization startup called Bestiaria. And it was also done about a little more than a year ago. It's a heat map that shows the usage of the Twitter hashtag SMW11 during Social Media Week in February 2011. Social Media Week last year drew 30,000 people in 9 cities, including London, New York, and Hong Kong. If the Facebook map documents connections, this one documents activity. You'll notice that it's red hot in most of the U.S. And in a large band of Western Europe, extending more or less from Scotland to the boot of Italy. It's plenty warm in Colombia and southeastern Brazil. There's a lot going on in India and East Asia. But note the green aura that's emanating from Egypt, which was having its own experience with social media at the time, because Friday, February 11th, 2011 was, which was the last day of Social Media Week last year, was also the day that Mubarak resigned. And so what does this map actually show us? Well, for one thing, it shows us that the distinction between creators and consumers, which was really characteristic of the industrial age, and certainly of industrial age media, of mass media, has broken down. It also, as we're moving from mass media, I think, to social media, there was a guy I saw at one of these conferences last year who remarked that mass media is antisocial. And it just struck me as a perfect summation of the situation with mass media and what it's going to have to change in order to get with the times. But recognizing this, I think, doesn't solve the problem that certainly people in the ad industry are facing. And that problem is, what do we do with this knowledge? And specifically, what do you do with it if you're in the business of trying to sell stuff? About 2 months ago, Nielsen released this Global Trust in Advertising survey. It was the 3rd time that they had done it. The survey was actually conducted in the fall of 2011. It was just released in April of this year. The first time they did it was in 2007. So I plotted the most interesting results. The survey involved 28,000 people in 56 countries, which is pretty much just about every country you can name off the top of your head. And what it shows is that word of mouth, whether it's in person or online, by people that you know, is by far the most trusted channel, and that it's getting more so fairly dramatically. The next category is online consumer ratings, Yelp and the like, and that's growing in trust as well. Meanwhile, company websites, Facebook pages, and the like are dropping, and trust in television ads is dropping much faster, and for the first time has fallen below 50%. But it's not just that people are, not paying much attention to TV spots anymore, and certainly not paying as much, or that they're, putting less faith in company-owned channels, company websites, and the like. It's that the most important channels, and the channels that are growing more important, are the ones you don't have any control over. The problem with earned media is you can't buy it, it has to be earned. And so if you want people to share more, I think we need to kind of understand why do we share. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. That brings us to this monkey. 20 years ago, a macaque monkey in Italy inadvertently demonstrated how connected we are. I like to think of him as Spinoza's monkey. This was in a lab at the University of Parma. And what happened was that in 1991, a group of neuroscientists at the university were painlessly inserting electrodes in these monkeys' brains. The neuroscientists were trying to map the frontal lobe, which is the area of the brain that's involved in rehearsing actions. And they wanted to see which neurons were firing. What they found was that the brain was very, very specialized. That you had, the monkeys had one neuron for holding something and a different neuron for tearing something apart, and so forth, for just about any kind of action that it could do. And then what happened was that they took a break, and as is often the case, that yielded the most interesting results. Because during the break, one of the research assistants was sitting at a table next to a monkey, eating an ice cream cone. And as he was eating the ice cream cone, somebody else noticed that a neuron was firing in the monkey's head. And specifically, it was a neuron that would have been firing if the monkey itself had been eating the ice cream cone. So they thought that was pretty interesting, so they decided to see if they could, reproduce the results. And they did things like putting food on the table, taking food off the table, and every time the same thing happened. This led to the theory, ultimately, of mirror neurons in the premotor cortex. The idea that we have neurons that mirror the experience of cells in other brains. And this, in turn, has come to be pretty widely accepted as the basis of empathy. We see something happen to someone else, we see someone else doing something, and it's almost as if we're experiencing that ourselves. Now, we can't stick electrodes into human brains, but we can do FMRI studies, and pretty much those have gotten the same results. Now, functional magnetic resonance imagery is a technique that measures blood flow in the brain. Contrary to what some people would have you believe, it won't show at all what anybody is thinking, but it will show what part of the brain is doing the thinking. One study that's kind of particularly interesting, 2009 at Washington University in St. Louis, they did an FMRI study of people who were reading stories. And the stories they were reading were all from this book. It's called One Boy's Day. It was published in 1951 by a pioneering psychologist named Roger Barker, who spent most of his career closely observing the inhabitants of a small town in Kansas. And this book documented the behavior of a particular human specimen who happened to be a 7-year-old named Raymond. And so they took the test subjects, nearly 60 years later. They slid them into the MRI machine, and they gave them passages from this book to read. And what happened was the same thing that happened with the monkeys, essentially. When they read about Raymond at school picking up his workbook, basically the same area that would have been activated in Raymond's brain was activated in the reader's brains, the area that's involved with grasping motions. When Raymond walks to the teacher's desk, the area of the brain that involves spatial location lit up. As with monkeys, again, there seemed to be this sort of biological basis for empathy, a fundamental connectedness, essentially, with other members of our species. So the question arises, what do we do with this connectedness? Well, obviously we can, friend people on Facebook, we can friend people in real life, we can follow one another on Twitter, we can share videos on YouTube. But at a more basic level, one key manifestation of this connectedness is our eagerness to share stories with one another. Humans seem to be uniquely motivated to share things that they know and stuff that they believe with other people. And the reason that we share, I think, what it ultimately comes down to is that life is a constantly functioning information exchange, and we rely on this exchange just to get by the day. We're always seeking and getting feedback. In fact, we're often getting it whether we're seeking it or not. This book by a guy named Brian Boyd, who I think is brilliant, and this is a fantastic book called On the Origin of Stories. It's essentially an evolutionary take on storytelling. And Boyd points out that we are incredibly focused on one another, and that we're always competing to share the latest news, the latest developments. But this kind of sharing is not necessarily altruistic. We don't particularly do this out of the goodness of our hearts. It seems to be much more strategic. We do it to get something, ultimately. It increases our status with other members of our group. It strengthens our links with other people. We can use it we can share information selectively to advance our goals. And benefits accrue to the sharer, as Boyd says, that we earn credit on the social information exchange. And there are also unwritten rules about the information exchange. We're constantly detecting and rejecting abuses of it. People who are boastful, people who are lying, people who are tattling on somebody else, people who are trying to use flattery, people who are slandering somebody else, the bore who tries to command our attention but doesn't offer anything of value. All of these tend to be rejected. And then there's gossip, which, aside from being a lot of fun, it's really all about getting people to fall in line, about enforcing the group norms. So we use sharing information like this to achieve an end, but the advantage that we get from it is not just personal, any more than the behavior is unique to any one individual. The behavior is pretty much universal among humans, and the advantage seems to be as well. So, recently these issues have been taken up by scientists. There was one paper that was done by some researchers in Budapest that cited a, quote, species-specific motivation to share one's beliefs and knowledge about the world. And these researchers speculated that this offers us a sort of an evolutionary advantage, ultimately, something that distinguishes us from the monkeys. So the implication being, or the claim being, that sharing not only gives us a personal advantage, but a species advantage. So then the question arises, what is it that we share? What do we talk about? And the evidence is ultimately that what we talk about, the kind of information that we share, has to do with our own experiences, ourselves, and things that matter to us. Some people have done some research on this, and they've concluded that somewhere between 30 and 40% of all human conversation is people talking about themselves or their experiences. It's been noted that babies begin drawing attention to things that they find important as early as 9 months of age. And then there was a study that just came out last month of a group of, I'm sorry, this one came out a couple of years ago, actually, an analysis of some Twitter users. And they found that only 22% of the tweets of the several hundred Twitter users that they were following were actually information sharing. And only about 2% were anecdotes about other people. There were about 5% that was, where people were putting questions to their followers. And then the rest was people telling stories about themselves, people talking about their opinions, people making random thoughts and observations, people announcing that they're present, and the sort of blatant self-promotion. They also found that there were essentially two types of users. About 20% were the type that they called the informers, which is actually people who, for the most part, offered useful information and were more focused on others, and perhaps not too surprisingly had a lot more friends and followers. The other 80% were focused on themselves and presumably had lower clout scores. The informers, though, were more influential, but the clear implication was that information is much more likely to be shared if it has something to do with the person sharing it. So the question now is, why is that? And what do we get out of sharing stuff? It turns out that we get a dopamine hit. This is a dopamine molecule. I discovered, by the way, it won the coveted Molecule of the Month award in 2008. So there you have it. Dopamine, of course, is a powerful neurotransmitter, which is instrumental in our sense of anticipation and reward. Anywhere that there's pleasure or the expectation of pleasure, dopamine is going to be involved, whether it's food, sex, drugs, money, what have you. Last month, and this is a paper that was last month, there were some researchers at Harvard who published a paper that looked into the question of why do we share from a neuroscience perspective. They were the first scientists to do this. And what they found two things, basically. First was that anytime we share information, we get a little squirt of dopamine. And the second thing they found is that we get a much bigger squirt, we get a much bigger reward from sharing our own opinions and attitudes than from discussing other people's. So this got reported in the media, and inevitably, TV shows and bloggers, reported it as, there was actually a headline that said, oversharing on Facebook is as satisfying as sex. Now that's not at all what they were saying. They were just saying that it involves the same pathways in the brain. Nonetheless, nobody ever got an orgasm from sharing a video. I think that's fairly clear. Maybe it suggests something that the user interface guys here should be working on. What it does show is that we get measurable pleasure from sharing information about ourselves. And not just talking about ourselves, but sharing information about what we find, sharing things that we find interesting or funny or moving, things that affect us emotionally, things that matter to us. As the Harvard researchers concluded, this, quote, motivation to discuss our internal thoughts and knowledge to others may serve to sustain the behaviors that underlie the extreme sociability of our species. It's certainly handy, I think, when it comes to intergalactic struggle. This, of course, is the most shared ad video of 2011. Volkswagen's The Force Spot. It was released online, I think about a week before it was aired on TV on the Super Bowl. And by the end of the year, it had gotten more than 63 million views, which is not nearly as many as the Lonely Islands I Just Had Sex video, but pretty significant nonetheless. More than any other ad video. What both of these videos say to people that we're sharing them with is, this is what I found funny, this is what I found significant, this is what I found worth sharing. In a sense, this is who I am. So the unruly people here have identified a number of factors that promote sharing, but ultimately I think it comes down to this, that underlying the incredible sociability of our species is the fact that everyone is at the center of his or her own network. And we're constantly sharing with one another, but generally it has little or nothing to do with the idea of being selfless. Because the big paradox of sharing is that it mostly has to do with me. So, thank you.
For those of you who haven't yet been on a tour of the Social Video Lab, there are more tours starting in the next few minutes. If you've enjoyed your taster tour this evening, then please do come speak to Louise, who always stood there waving her hand and is taking bookings for lab sessions. So for more bespoke sessions, if you want to have your content evaluated, use the biometric testing, see which triggers get people sharing, and work out how to best use your marketing budgets. Okay, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening.